Let's reconvene and get started. I understand Senator Roberts has some questions for the NIAA, and so I give the call to you, Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for appearing today. What are the total dollar costs to the taxpayer of holding the proposed voice referendum?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Sorry, the seat is very high. Don't know how to get lower. In the 2023-24 budget, the government provided $364.6 million over 3 years from 2022-23. That included $336.6 over 2 years for the AEC to deliver the referendum. That includes $10.6 million to produce information pamphlets for the yes and no cases. $12 million over 2 years to deliver civics education program on the referendum, the Constitution and the referendum proposal. $10.5 million in 2023-24 for the Department of Health and Aged Care to increase mental health supports.
How much was that again?
$10.5 million in 2023-24. And that's to increase mental health support for First Nations people during the period of the referendum. And $5.5 million in 2023-24 to the NIAA to maintain existing resourcing levels to support the referendum. And those measures build on measures from the budget in October last year. And those measures were $50.2 million for the AEC to commence preparations for the referendum, $6.5 million over 2 years to NIAA to support the referendum, and $2.4 million to the Department of Finance and the Attorney General's Department.
That totals 364.
So 364 in 23-24 plus those figures from the October budget last year.
And the $10.5 million to be spent on mental health, what is that for?
I think we've got colleagues, Senator, from the Department of Health in the room next door. We might just get them to come in so they can provide more detail on that.
Thank you.
I just note too that was a follow-up question for Senator Stewart as well around the mental health.
They're coming in, are they?
Someone has gone to get them, I think.
Okay.
They've left.
They're coming now, Senator.
Hi, Senator. Governor Matthews, First Assistant Secretary of First Nations Health Division. We missed the question, but I think the question was to understand a little bit more about the $10.5 million for mental health support for the referendum. Was that the question?
That's correct.
Yeah. And so, sorry, we sort of just missed when we were running through. You both asked the same question. That's good. Just clarify, I've got the frame of the answer right. Senator Roberts, how are you? Yes, Senator, so the budget does provide $10.5 million in support for mental health for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the referendum. That's in recognition that the referendum process may have an impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and cause levels of concern around the debate that plays out publicly in that, and so that it's to provide additional supports in places they can go. The measure will basically provide funding through to the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, who will coordinate the use of that funding for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to reach in. It'll provide a range of supports for people. That will be co-designed very heavily with NACCHO and other mental health experts into the design and delivery of that funding. And there is also $500,000 in there for a process to look at the monitor and evaluate that process as well.
So the $10 million is for mental health assistance,
yes,
and $500,000 for monitoring that
yes,
assistance.
Yep.
Are there any expected mental health issues?
Well, there's obviously wide research over time about the impacts of racism on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the impact that that has on their mental health well-being and indeed their broader health outcomes. So that is a known phenomenon. So I think there's also a range of literature and also lived experience that when there is a range of public discussions around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs or things that are sensitive around that, that can bring up issues for people and make things difficult for that. So it's to ensure that there is support for that. Part of this also leverages back to the experience of the same-sex marriage debate, where that I think the learnt experience out of that is that that also did raise issues for many people in the in affected communities for that that were looking for increased support through that process. And so it's looking at what happened in that experience, and this is really framed to respond to that experience and ensure that up front we've got supports in place and are expanding on it. That it builds on also the existing mental health effort is probably the other bit that I should add in. So it's not a standalone thing. The government invests probably about $1.5 billion, $1.5 billion per year on mental health funding overall. That's for for mainstream and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so there's obviously specific things within that funding for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health generally, but also the mainstream population. This will put a specific support over and above that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but obviously the vast weight of that money is also for...
what do you mean by mainstream population?
The broader Australian population, so that anybody can access.
Can you confirm the total sum of $781.5 million was allocated to the NIAA in the October 22-23 budget, building on $1 billion and $21.9 million previously announced? That's a lot of money. Figures are taken from the budget papers. Are they correct?
We have our CFO online. Nick, did you just want to confirm those for the Senator, please?
Thanks.
Chief Financial Officer. Sorry, could I ask you to repeat that question, Senator?
Can you confirm the total sum of $781.5 million was allocated to the NIAA in the October 22-23 budget, building on $1 billion and $21.9 million previously announced?
Senator, I will have that for you shortly. I just have to quickly draw on the October portfolio budget statements. Might be best if you go to your next question, Senator, and then I will come back to you when I've got the answer for you.
Okay. Does the role of the NIAA, the National Indigenous Australians Agency, already include raising issues to government that are specific to the needs of the 4% Indigenous population of Australia?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. The NIAA has a broad role working right across government, leading and influencing right across government, and leading a couple of important pieces of work like Closing the Gap. So we do have that role, but we're also a deliverer of programs to First Nations people right across the country as well. That is a role that we take quite seriously, is that leading and influencing and working in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but we are a government agency.
So will the NIAA still be relevant if the Voice proceeds?
I think there's a lot of work to be done before that question can be answered, and we don't have a position on that at the moment.
The response is yes, Senator.
Thank you. Should the yes vote in the coming referendum be successful, please tell us what the setup costs of the Voice are estimated to be and what the yearly running costs of the Voice would be.
So, Senator, of course, the work to date has been in terms of establishing design principles for a Voice. That is the work of the Referendum Working Group. In terms of how the Voice will function, a lot of that obviously will happen through a consultation process that will be conducted post-referendum in finalising the design, and of course that design would be considered by Parliament. So ultimately some of those features that you're describing will be things that Parliament will need to consider.
So we don't know the cost then, really?
At this stage, no.
Okay. And then there'll be many costs involved. There's direct costs and then there are indirect costs in terms of another entity being put in place in the legislative process, for example?
So, Senator, I think it would just be sort of a bit speculative at this stage to try and predict what the costs might be associated with the administration of a voice. As I said, there are design principles, so we know some of the elements of how the voice may function, but indeed many of the things around the specifics of the design will be things that will be considered through a consultation process with the broader Australian community and be settled with Parliament as well involved.
Yeah, Minister, it leaves me concerned because the way this Parliament works, it doesn't work on data when it makes policies and legislation. To have an open-ended script, open and blank cheque, doesn't seem the right way to go. So I've got some questions for you representing the Prime Minister. Why are these costs of running the voice being held back from Australian voters?
Senator Roberts, there's nothing being held back. We've been as open and transparent as we can be in terms of our steps towards the campaign, in terms of the referendum itself. We've certainly been open and transparent about the costs that are associated with running a referendum, the costs associated with running a civics education campaign, and the costs, of course, in terms of the actual referendum itself right across the country. We've also been very clear that should the campaign and the referendum be successful, then that debate has to occur within the Parliament, and that will take whatever the next 12 months will be post the referendum. We're also incredibly mindful that this is a challenge, and it will be up to the Australian people to determine whether they've got enough information as we lead into the campaign proper. We still have to debate the constitutional alteration bill that's before the House at the moment. We still have to debate it in the Senate, and we still have some work to do just here in the Parliament.
So there's a lot of uncertainty.
Well, there's always uncertainty about any referendums, Senator.
Especially when the proposal is not clearly defined.
Well, the debate hasn't concluded in the Australian Parliament yet.
While people are tightening their belts during this period of out-of-control costs with savage inflation biting and huge costs of living increases, how can Australians afford this expensive exercise of destroying the Australian parliamentary system of democracy that has worked so well to date?
Well, Senator, I totally disagree with your concept that any debate that we are having right now is destroying anything other than enabling our country to have the democratic conversation that we should.
I agree with you. Debates are always wonderful, very useful if they're done openly. And that's my concern. It's
before the House at the moment. It comes to the Senate. There is nothing that has not been brought before the Parliament in terms of the bills. I mean, this is where we have the open debates.
I'm talking about the definition of what the voice would look like, how it will operate, what the systems will be, where it will impact.
Those principles and the design principles are very clear, Senator. You may not accept them or like them, but they are very transparent and open for everyone to see.
It's not a matter of whether I like them or not.
Well, it clearly must be, because
definition.
You keep referring to the fact that there's nothing out there when it is out there in terms of the design principles. We've said that on numerous occasions here in this estimates process. It is there on the website. It is there in the information for the public to access.
Do you think the Australian voters will support a yes vote if they know how much this will cost them in taxes to pay for it? Because it will cost a lot of money to put in additional bureaucracy.
Senator Roberts, any referendum in this country is very difficult to win. 44 have been held, only 8 have been won. We acknowledge that this is a challenge and the Australian people will determine the outcome.
But this is an open cheque written by on behalf of the Australian taxpayers. There's so many things that are undefined. The direct costs of running the voice, if it gets up, then the indirect costs and the impact on so many operations in this country are huge.
The process has not concluded. The bill is before the Parliament in the House and yet to be debated in the Senate. We have not concluded the process of the Parliament, and therefore, when we do, there will be many things that the Australian people can make their decisions on.
So why isn't the government talking about the indirect and direct costs of running the Voice if it gets in?
Well, you've seen the total already. I mean, we've been talking about
No,
the
that's the
figures
referendum.
in terms of the referendum, but we've also looked at the costs of going forward with regional voices. These are things that we are bringing forward in terms of our debate in the Parliament, and I think I've made that very clear.
But the Labor Party or the government has not talked about the potential negatives openly with the people. The frustration of parliamentary processes, the addition of a 9th chapter. We've only heard the benefits, and even those have been very, very vague. This doesn't give people confidence.
Well, only time will see on that front,
Okay.
Senator.
What will be the other costs to voters from the slowing down of government, bogged down with court proceedings and increased bureaucracy?
Well, Senator Roberts, as we've heard from legal experts across the country, that will not be the case.
How many new jobs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will be created by the Voice?
This will be an opportunity for First Nations people in every state and territory jurisdiction to be able to speak to the Parliament and the Executive should we be successful at this referendum, which will also mean that local regional voices will also be there established. And in terms of particular jobs right now, what our focus is on jobs across the CDP sector, the health sector, in terms of the 500 health positions that we want to roll out. I mean, these are connected, Senator Roberts, in terms of where we want to lift the problems that we encounter right across the country.
Last one.
Minutes now. Great. And then I'll give the call to Senator Steele-John, and then we're back over to this side. Thank you.
How many new bureaucratic officers, Minister, will need to be found, and what will be the salaries of the thousands of new positions created to service the Voice?
Well, I'd certainly like to think that our First Nations regions, in terms of the Voice, should it be successful, will need the capability of a secretariat of sorts to assist them in terms of defining specifically what that will be. Clearly, we have to see what happens with the outcome of the referendum and our debate post that.
Well, sticking to that point about the bureaucracy, having travelled to quite a few of all of the communities on Cape York, mixed communities, Aboriginal communities, they're very, very concerned with and frustrated and sometimes angry by the lack of impact of the funds that we give them on the ground, and they see that the bureaucracy takes it, whether that be black people, white people, it doesn't matter, the bureaucrats, the lawyers, the activists, the politicians. People are frustrated. They want real change, not more bureaucracy.
And nowhere is that more clearer than those of us who've only just come into government in the last 12 months, Senator. We understand that, and that's why we're trying to create the changes that we see will give our country hope going forward.
But you're adding another layers of bureaucracy.
We're giving hope.
Thank you, Chair.
Senator Steele-John.
Thank you very much, Chair. Minister, I'm sure you'd join with